specifically regarding lifting, we have basically a setup here. You can see the little stick diagram. We have the head, the rib cage, the pelvis, thigh, and lower leg here. So we have this person kind of hinged forward a little bit. You'll notice that there's a slight lordosis in the back. There's a slight curve of the spine moving forward. That's what we term a neutral spine. A normal spine, when somebody's standing with a good upright posture, has a slight forward sway. Then in the rib cage it sways back a little bit. Then in the neck it sways forward again. So as that person goes to hinge forward in order to grab a barbell or a stone or a dumbbell, they can keep their spine neutral, basically meaning that they keep that normal posture, which allows them that forward sway in the lower part of the spine. Okay? Then we have the other option, which means we don't keep a neutral spine. We end up going into a slight bit of flexion as we move forward. So the two examples, one more of a hip hinge, the other the hip is hinging, but we're also getting some rounding of the spine. Now, lately in scientific literature in different areas, this has been found to be the injurious movement. Basically, you'll injure your back if you lift with a rounded spine, but if you keep it neutral, you won't injure your back. Does that make sense? So you can see that we can get insult. Now I can insult my tissue here. How many people have watched somebody deadlift with a neutral spine and the next day they come in and go, those deadlifts killed me. They had perfect spine, they had a perfectly neutral spine the whole workout, but the deadlifts injured them. They haven't recovered from it. It had nothing to do with whether they were neutral or whether they were rounded. They haven't recovered from that workout. So that got me thinking, watching all these people are deadlifting with rounded spines, but they come back and they don't tell me that anything hurts, but these other people are deadlifting with neutral spines and they're telling me that something does hurt. And then the opposite. I have somebody with a rounded spine tell me that something hurts, but somebody with a neutral spine tell me that it doesn't hurt. So I'm starting to think in my head, what is actually causing the injury? What is the actual problem? Well, the actual problem is they haven't recovered from the workout. And there are certain time periods where we want to keep a neutral spine, and there are certain time periods where it's okay to round that spine a little bit. Okay? So let's talk about what actually happens at the spine and why this is a problem. Here we have a neutral spine. We have the sacrum, which is the base, the tailbone down here. We then have a little squishy disc, and then we go into our lumbar vertebrae. Our vertebrae are basically bony blocks stacked on top of each other, and then a little squishy disc in between there. Those squishy discs are designed to absorb what's called compression. Compression is where you push two surfaces together, basically squeezing those things. That's what they're designed to handle. What they don't handle well is a force called shear force. So shear force is when one surface slides over another. So me standing here on one foot is compressing my foot into the ground. Me and my sock feet sliding across the floor, that's shear. Okay? So if I stand here, I'm okay. If I start sliding back and forth, I start to wear away my skin. Okay? That basically wears away to the vertebrae when I create shear force. Okay? So how do we create shear force in the spine, and how do we prevent shear force in the spine? Well, basically, shear force is when one vertebrae gets pushed past the other vertebrae. Okay? So as I hinge forward in this neutral spine, what's happening is gravity is pushing downward on one vertebrae on top of the other. And so I'm getting this anterior forward shear force of one side versus the other. And so this right here gets pushed forward, and this gets pushed forward, and this gets pushed forward. And that creates a shear force. Okay? Now, how my body prevents that is we have these giant spinal erector muscles. We have these big Greek pillars of muscles in our back. There's two sets of what are called our spinal erectors. One are the larger ones that we can see. The others are smaller ones right next to the spine. And both of those have a little bit different orientation that's going to play a role here. So the bigger muscles come off the sides of our hips, and they come up about 5 or 6 vertebrae, okay? And they attach into different levels of the spine. So they'll come up, they'll attach into a couple of spaces here in the lumbar vertebrae, basically coming off that lower part of the pelvis and up through. And so each layer comes up. Those are major muscle groups right there. Okay? As I hinge forward, you can see that those major muscle groups, as they insert onto the vertebrae, have what's called a posterior shear force. So we have gravity pushing this way, but then we have those muscles with an ability to pull back in the other direction. And so when we're in a neutral spine and we're hinged forward, lifting that barbell off the ground, lifting that dumbbell, lifting that stone with a neutral spine, it's these giant muscles here that allow us to pull backwards and prevent one vertebrae from sliding forward on the other. Is that clear to everybody? So the literature from Stu McGill talks about how when we round the spine, what ends up happening is these giant muscle groups end up losing their posterior shear. And so what happens is, as I go forward and I round my spine, now I end up without the ability, notice from here, coming up in this direction, you can see that this no longer has an ability to pull backwards. It instead pulls in more of a compressive force. And so there's nothing resisting that posterior shear. So what ends up happening is the one vertebrae slides over top of the other. So when I'm doing deadlift after deadlift, rounding my spine over and over again, these muscles don't protect the posterior shear, and there's a potential for more anterior shear. And that's where we start to get disc degeneration, low back arthritis, disc bulges, disc herniations, all those different problems. Okay? Now, the issue is I've seen a whole lot of people lifting with rounded spines, old strength athletes used to deadlift with rounded spines on a regular basis. I've seen athletes in here for 4 or 5 years, which should be enough time to degenerate that spine, not have those issues. So I started experimenting with myself. I started saying, okay, well, what do I feel when I start lifting with a rounded spine? And I'll tell you what I felt. I didn't feel fatigue of these giant muscle groups. I felt fatigue of the smaller muscle groups, the ones that are right next to the spine. So these span anywhere from 1 to 4 segments. They're called basically the intrinsic spinal erectors. They're the ones really close to the spine. And so if you'll notice, when I go from one segment to the next, and one segment to the second, and one segment to the third, I still, one segment to the third, I still have a line of posterior pull. And so instead of the extrinsic muscle group being what prevents that anterior shear, it's the intrinsic muscle group. It's the small muscles right there that prevent that one vertebrae from sliding on top of the other. So what implication does that have in insult, irritation, injury, and pain? If I lift a stone off the ground with a rounded spine because that's the only way that I can get my arms around that stone and get it up to my shoulder, I create an insult. Now that insult is first absorbed by those small muscles. Those little muscles there basically do their job, much like the adductors and the thighs and the hamstrings and the glutes do that for squatting. These small muscles absorb that for lifting with a rounded spine. And so I have some insult to those muscles. If I leave it there and I allow myself to recover, I'm now fitter. I can now lift a heavier stone with a rounded spine. I can now lift that stone more times in 5 minutes without creating an anterior shear. Now what happens when I insult those muscles, but to a degree that's greater than what their strength is? I then start to allow some anterior shear. Those muscles can no longer pull backwards, and so they start to allow that to shear forward. So if I insult not just the musculature, but the musculature beyond what it's capable of, I end up allowing that vertebrae to slide forward, and I start to damage the disc. So as I insult the disc and I don't allow it to recover, I start to get disc irritation. And as I irritate the disc further and don't allow it to recover, I end up with a disc injury. I end up with a herniation or a bulge of some kind. I start to notice some low back issues. Now from there, as that gets further and further, we have nerves that come out through here that go all the way down the legs, out the neck, and into the arms. And those nerves end up getting irritated, and now we have all kinds of problems. But to reverse that process, we need to recover from the injury. We need to recover from the irritation. We need to recover from the insults in order to allow ourselves to get fitter. Now, to me, that doesn't mean staying in a neutral spine forever. That means getting strong in these small muscle groups. That means getting strong in the smaller intrinsic muscles so that they recover from the insult so that we're fitter instead of just avoiding that. Because what happens when we avoid movements? Eventually, we actually have to do it. We have, the milk slid into the back of the trunk, and now I have to reach all the way over into the trunk to get it. There's almost no way to get there with a neutral spine. I've got to get a little further, which means I round my spine. Now I grab it and I pull. If those muscles are strong, if these intrinsic muscles are strong, I have no anterior shear. I have no problem. If those intrinsic muscles are weak, that's when I reach into the bottom of the fridge. Oh, I've sprained myself. I've irritated that disc to the point where now it's injured.